Sports Network is absolutely free. Just
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our third segment of the day, we are transitioning into the last of our positional rankings, starting off with the tight end position before we get into our defenses for our fourth segment of the day. But like I always say, tight ends are the most volatile position, most under-respected in the league, but they're still very important week by week because they are a position where you feel like it's definitely more matchups oriented than others. It's not necessarily like running backs and wide receivers where if you're a star every week. It's more so about, okay, this team plays a certain coverage, their pass defense has been pretty bad, and so these tight ends can expose them. It's not necessarily about a stud anymore. It's more about different tiers and how they interact with each other. So this list of 4 players that I've compiled, each in their own right, represents a different kind of tier of tight end. They can either be excellent one week and terrible the next, or they've kind of been steady presences at the tight end position for years. And so, without further ado, let us talk about the position that is most interesting to rank my tight end. Starting off with a guy who really can be an X factor for the Jaguars for the rest of the season, if they're competitive at all. Evan Engram, going up against perhaps the toughest defense in the NFC against the Lions. And the reason why I feel Evan Engram, no matter who's playing quarterback, can perform against the Lions is just because he is someone who has developed so well as a route runner that you kind of have to account for him as a receiver. And it's difficult to do when he's aligned in the slot, aligned on the edge, on the perimeters, because of his A, physicality, his big frame, and B, his excellence at the catch point. And so, while the Lions are a team that are very physical in the secondary, a lot of improvement to their players week in, week out, Evan Engram is a different animal because he is one of the leaders of this kind of skill position group on the offensive side of the football for Jacksonville. And if the Jacksonville offense wants to have any modicum of success against a defense like the Lions, you need a guy like Evan Engram to step up. And whether it be Trevor Lawrence or Mac Jones, look for them to use him as a security blanket early and often in this game. He had 10 fantasy points against a very similar defense in terms of aggressiveness in Minnesota. So it's not necessarily a bad total for someone who has been kind of forgotten this season from a fantasy perspective. Maybe because of the injury early on in the season and how he recuperated from that. But he still is someone you always have to monitor from a fantasy perspective because of how efficient he can be. Should this quarterback play continue and start to get more consistent. So Evan Engram, a little bit of a risky pick, but still one who can really produce for you at a kind of consistent level where he's not necessarily putting up gaudy numbers, but consistent numbers, just right for the tight end position type numbers. So look for him to try and exploit a very physical Lions defense. And then the second guy I want to talk about, kind of always there and thereabouts in lists of these nature, maybe potentially a little bit hindered by his consistent injuries with that leg. Always a concern for this guy, but no matter what, he's always going to be someone who is consistent on a regular basis and might just be perhaps the most consistent tight end from a fantasy perspective in the entire National Football League right now. And he's going up against Evan Engram's Jags, Sam Laporta. And not for nothing, I feel like, this has been a down year for him. Everyone was hyped about him after that rookie season where he was the tight end one, albeit with a very, weak statistical kind of achievement in that regard. But he still is someone who a lot of people in fantasy football circles hold in a high regard as perhaps the kind of leader of a youth movement at the tight end position. He had 15.6 fantasy points against Houston last week, despite, perhaps battling through more injuries. And that's always going to be a concern with him because, much like last year, he had a lot of problems with that leg, especially going into the playoffs. So that's a little bit of a concern to monitor. But when he's on the field, when he's healthy, this Lions offense loves having him. Because, even though they have kind of gone more towards the run this season, Sam Laporta is just someone who can exploit you if you're looking for the run. Like that touchdown against Houston where it looked like a run design and they got him open in the end zone and he scored a touchdown. So he's always someone who the Lions feel they can utilize the best of their abilities. And against the Jags defense that, yes, has been very tough to play against in recent weeks, it's still perhaps the weakest defense in the NFL at this point. And so look for Sam Laporta to take advantage of this matchup and continue to prove why, as a young, exciting tight end, up-and-comer, he is going to be one of the premier tight ends in fantasy. And perhaps kind of one of those guys who can say, hey, maybe we have to respect tight ends a little bit more in fantasy football circles. So look for him to continue his ascension at the position. And then another guy, a little bit on the older side, perhaps the polar opposite of Sam Laporta in this regard, going up against a team he's all too familiar with, Travis Kelce, going up against the Bills. 20.4 points last week against Denver. Solid performance, continuing to be a valuable asset for this Chiefs offense. Perhaps the leader right now of this offense as they've gone through a couple of struggles over the past couple of weeks. But against the Bills, look for him to stay consistent. The Bills, potentially in this game, are going to play a lot of zone coverage to limit what Patrick Mahomes can do downfield. So look for him to take advantage of the easy receptions and targets that Travis Kelce can give you. And so that's why I feel like this duality between young and old comes into play. Even though Sam Laporta has the easier matchup, I feel like Travis Kelce is the safer bet just because of his experience in games of this magnitude and because he's going to know what the Bills are going to throw at him because of how they game plan for teams like Kansas City. So I feel like, including these two guys is paramount to kind of show the contrast between where we are in viewing young and old tight ends. And Travis Kelce stands the test of time. No matter how long he's going to continue to play, he's always going to be the most reliable target for Patrick Mahomes in that offense. And even, if he does decline, potentially, and his target share goes down a little bit, if he continues to play, just know that Patrick Mahomes isn't going to be swayed by that. He's always going to view Travis Kelce as an asset in this system. And against teams that want to knock you down a peg, I feel like you're going to have to play your best games in those situations. And not for nothing, the Bills are undefeated against the Chiefs in the Patrick Mahomes era in the regular season. So if you want a player to step up for you, it's going to have to be a guy like Travis Kelce, who's been on this road before. So I can't doubt him in a game of this magnitude against an opponent he's all too familiar with. And so that's why I feel like, I had to present these two guys in that way. Sam Laporta as a young guy who is a paragon of consistency against these inferior opponents, and Travis Kelce, who we know has been around the block and is up against a much tougher opponent, but kind of knows how to break them down. And so that's why it's so interesting to see both of these guys make my list for Week 11. But the last guy I'm going to talk about, again, is kind of one of those lower tier guys who suddenly has arrived on the scene fully for the Green Bay Packers. Has been quiet for the past couple of weeks, but might in this game be able to make some noise. And that is Mr. Tucker Kraft here. Had a bye week, and now the Packers go and face the Bears. an interesting divisional matchup. Not necessarily the best divisional matchup, but one that could be exciting nonetheless. Just because I'm looking at these Packers receivers against the Bears secondary. Two of the younger units in the league. Two of the more scrappy, hungry, diverse units in the league. And when I think about how they line up against each other, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in the Shadow Report, I feel like there's going to be a lot of opportunities for a guy like Tucker Kraft to exploit that Bills secondary a little bit. He's going to try and sit in the pockets between the linebackers and safeties. He's going to try and, help Jordan Love in the short to intermediate passing game. And he's going to also, most importantly, just try and keep the ball with the Packers for as long as possible because, this Bears offense just fired its offensive coordinator in Shane Waldron, should never have been in the NFL in the first place, and I should know that firsthand as a Seattle fan. And they're going to try and get going yet again, but still, you have to respect that about them, that they feel that they on offense can head in the right direction, get back on track. But I feel like in terms of this game, the Packers want to be as efficient as possible, and not get caught up in what the Bears defense can do to them. Because when the Bears defense generates takeaways, that's how they can win football games. So look for the Packers to not necessarily press the situation and, just try and play turnover-free football. And so Tucker Kraft is going to be a big part of that. And I feel like, the reason why a guy like Tucker Kraft has been so volatile this season and been so under the radar in certain sectors of the fantasy football world is because this Packers offense is so unpredictable. Week in, week out, someone can step up over it, and we wouldn't bat an eye just because we know that any receiver can be the lead receiver for the Packers at any given moment. So that's why I feel like Tucker Kraft has been a little bit of a one player who's fallen to the wayside over the past couple of weeks. But look for him to get back on track against the Bears defense that might get exposed if they can't generate turnovers early and often in this one. But let me know what you think in the comments, because the tight end position, as always, is not always going to be about Laporta and Kelce. They're not always going to be on this list. I want to include more guys like Ingram and Kraft because I know what they're capable of. And so, look for me to continue to vary my list, especially when it comes to tight ends. Let me know what you think in the comments about each of these players. They're all very intriguing matchups that I feel favored their best abilities. But coming up next, we conclude officially my positional rankings for Week 11 with my defense and special teams units to monitor for this week in fantasy. We'll be right back after this short break.